Hi, this is Warren Herman. In this video, what we're going to do is we're going to attempt to describe the application of a Catholic understanding of the human mind in order to help us to overcome whatever problems we're facing in life. The reason why this is important is because in attempting to deal with the different problems that somebody can have as a human being, just simply the different challenges that exist in life, we can try to apply various different kinds of techniques. And the way that we apply the techniques has to do with how we understand who we are. One of the most important things about the Christian religion is that it posits that there is a fundamental change. Something actually happens to us. This is deeply overlooked in many different respects, but there is a true sense in which things like baptism are understood to bring about actual interior shifts in what a human being is. Essentially, a baptized person is not a normal human being anymore. A baptized person is like it's essentially the difference between a candle that has never been lit and a candle that is lit. There is a change, a fundamental alteration, a culmination of purpose, a real difference. And this difference in which the person goes from a natural being to a being that is inhabited by God is actually very psychologically relevant. And the problem is that many of the different ways that we would talk about the human personality, there are ways of talking about its natural function and the function that it can have in this new way. One of the things that I would like to bring up is the simple understanding that when somebody is rightly understanding the parts of their mind, they're able to understand where they live, so to speak. The importance of this cannot be understated, because many of the problems we have come from feeling that we are in danger. The reason why we feel we are in danger is because we are not in the actual, we don't understand the structure of our interior life. And we think we are in danger because of various things. So for example, there are various movements. So for example, let's say somebody becomes angry or something is a disturbing stimulus in our environment. Essentially, if a person decides to, if they try to not get angry or these type of things, and they disturb themselves saying, oh, I shouldn't have this feeling, or they try to not have the feeling, and they do all kinds of things trying to do that. There are different ways that the person steps out of a place of serenity, tries to resolve this problem, and gets themselves embroiled in it. Or they might get themselves embroiled in it simply by deciding to consent fully to this movement and decided to blow up in anger. So essentially what happens is that we lose the high ground. We lose this the real understanding of where we should be in ourselves. This type of principle was understood by people like St. Francis de Sales when he gives his advice of not really giving too much heed to the movements of what he calls the inferior parts of the soul, meaning that there are things that can come and go in our kind of in our mind, and we just should let those things go. This is actually stated, although Martin Luther is not a Catholic saint. We would say Martin Luther did have an interesting quote where he says, we can't stop the birds from flying over our head, but we can stop them from making a nest in our hair. And essentially this was referring to the fact that there are various movements inside of us that we could just kind of let them go by. We don't have to address them. We don't have to do anything about them. This is also paralleled in what is described in the Eastern Catholic and Eastern Orthodox traditions as the logismoi, which are the thoughts that come into the mind, the various movements and temptations and kinds of things that kind of arise in the mind, but that these logismoi are not necessarily, they're not important. We aren't supposed to worry about them. Just kind of dispassionately notice that they come in and don't worry about them. This orientation toward the mind, this taking a high ground in the mind, this taking a place of awareness and prayer is very significant, because it means that a person understands who they are in Christ. A person realizes that they aren't necessarily the various movements of the mind, that who they are is somebody in Christ. They are not defined by the movements of the mind, the body, and all these things. This is similar to what St. Paul talks about when he says that there is the inner man, or the law that he sees operating in his members, in his flesh. He talks about this. He talks, "I rejoice in the law, in the inner man, but in my flesh I don't." So there's these terms, or the carnal mind, the spiritual mind. These kinds of concepts are important because they give us a kind of topography of our inner experience that, if misapplied, leads to very significant psychological distress. Because if somebody thinks that they need to recondition or retrain their mind, they then step down and begin to apply and get lost in technique. So, for example, there can be benefit in thinking about what our thoughts are about a subject. There can be benefit from various things of thinking better thoughts. There can be benefit in reflecting on things, these type of techniques. But the thing is that we have to understand everything in its right order. We have to understand that this kind of the knowing mind, the relational mind, this self in Christ, this inner room, this kind of level, what we might call in the Eastern Catholic or Eastern Orthodox traditions, the noetic level, the nous, N-O-U-S, the spiritual heart. That's like the top, that's the important thing. That's the top level here. A person needs to know who they are. They need to know and the way that this works is that you have to understand, it's kind of like if a person feels unsafe, because the thing is, the effect of not understanding who we are in Christ is a sense of a lack of safety. Because this is what happens when the person feels, as St. Francis de Sales talks a lot about, how people feel overthrown by issues of, so for example, temptations. If we don't understand that who we are in Christ, we then have this effect where the temptations are kind of like a horrible monster going around the outside of the house, growling in the windows, and we think that we're in danger, but we're inside the house with Christ. And so the thing is we might, if we don't understand who we are, the psychological techniques we'll use to deal with these things will actually inflame the problems we have. An example of this would be the problem of scrupulosity. So, for example, a person who is scrupulous will have a thought kind of intrude into their mind. And because they're afraid, they don't realize who they are, and they don't realize psychologically. They might mentally, but they don't experientially understand how to shift into that understanding of that you are safe because you are in Christ. And that simple assurance of that and that knowing of that, if we don't have that understanding, that the thing that's happening is that this perceived danger of these movements of fear will then greatly enhance. So the thing is that there might be an intrusive thought they don't want, and this thought comes in, and you say, "Oh no," because there's a lack of understanding that this thought is not dangerous, because this thought does not reach where you live, unless you decide to go and say, "Hey, I'm going to consent to this, or I'm going to oppose this, or I don't want this." When we don't want it, we're stepping out of our fortress. We're stepping down out of that level. We're not just saying, "Okay, let's let the birds fly." Whatever happens, lower movements don't matter. And then the lower movements paradoxically eventually calm themselves down because, the person is not getting inflamed, reacting against them. So here's the thing. The thing is, you got to know who you are in Christ. This is the Christian anthropology. This is why this is very important psychologically. We've got to understand that. If we don't understand that, that makes us have to fight battles that we shouldn't fight and get caught up and inflame everything when we're trying to fix it. So that's very problematic. It's very psychologically damaging, very distressing. And the thing is that if we don't use this Christian understanding of the person, we end up creating a monster out of the interventions that we use. So rather than because we have to have everything come from this understanding of who we are in Christ, of the safety that we have in Christ. If we don't have that safety in Christ, the understanding of who we are in Christ, this understanding of this relationship with Christ, then we end up having lots of problems, because then we say, okay, well then then we might end up like in a 12-step therapy, for example, that might have to take into account the issues of the heart with a higher power and so on and so forth. But there's still this sense of maybe you could have a sense of a lack of a complete understanding of this. So that might not be the best approach, because then you end up maybe with different distortions that come up. So distortions from the 12-step approach could be things like, oh, look, I have to go to meetings or else I'm gonna relapse. There's many things that you could get various errors. If you don't have that complete understanding of who you are in Christ. That's why sometimes in 12-step movements that are Christian, they don't stop at that understanding of, oh, I'm an alcoholic. They'll say things like, I'm a child of God, recovering from this. So you could have things where the person may say, like, oh, I'm an alcoholic. Then there's some merit to that, to kind of overcome denial. But it's not good to stop there and get yourself stuck. So there's this element, you might lose something if you don't have this real understanding of who you are. Same thing with a cognitive approach. You might be starting to think positive or think clearly, or questioning your thoughts all the time, trying to think the right way, and that may have some value. But if you don't understand who you are in Christ, you're not going to do that out of a sense of safety. You're going to kind of having this battle, this ongoing battle. It's not like it's completely useless. There can be times, it could be worth doing an exercise if you're really caught up on some type of a thought, to debate the thought or something. But it's like, but to live there and to think you need to be living that way, that's going to destroy. That's disordered, because the real thing we want to keep in order is this thing of who I am in Christ, the safety I have in Christ. And then these other approaches, whether it's they can kind of come in and be used, in this other context. And the same thing. So you might want to think about something. You might want to whether I'm going to pray about something, think about something, make a decision or resolution, my will, do something behavioral, you call it a cognitive or a behavioral experiment. That's fine too. But we want to understand these things in light of who we are. We want to understand these things in light of who we are, and that and that means who we are in relation to Christ and His church. That means who we are. That means that we have to keep all that at the highest level. And the same thing of even just being aware of other things, like if we want to use something like like a mindfulness type approach, awareness has to be understood in these contexts, or else it can be we can get off the rails with awareness. We got to think, okay, I am the awareness, rather than, oh, who I am in Christ. Okay, I'm aware. In the Eastern Catholic or Eastern Orthodox understanding, there's a phrase, prayer purifies watchfulness, and watchfulness purifies prayer. If we don't have a sense of who we are in Christ, we can end up with a very distorted sense of who we are ultimately. Because then we can really think that our sense of self, this kind of, and naturally, a person who doesn't have this understanding of who they are in Christ can come to an understanding that's very similar. They can understand that they are safe because they are ultimately not any of these other levels. They're not the mind. They're not what they do. They're not what they think. They're not what their body is doing, and therefore they're safe. But then again, they end up with this understanding of the noetic level. This is the thing that happens like in Buddhism and the Eastern religions, where you end up understanding who you are as the image of God, but you think it is God because you're like, okay, I am this thing that is not subject to any of these lower levels. It's free. It's this and that, and then you end up with this kind of split between you and all the lower levels, and you can't use them. They don't really make sense in the context, because it's like, okay, but the thing is, when you're in Christ, it kind of integrates everything, because it's like, okay, I am something more. All these, I'm something more. I'm in Christ, but these things are elements of me. These things are parts of me. And even the failures, the sins, that you're going to understand these things as a relational thing. It gives you some way of understanding this thing and not disintegrating and not separating the two parts of the human personality. So there's definitely ways in which you can kind of find a true self from a secular perspective, or from an Eastern religion's perspective, and the therapies, all these things. You can find a sense of safety in this secular understanding. You can find a sense of safety even on a natural level. You can say, okay, well, my thoughts aren't dangerous. You don't have to be thinking necessarily about Christ in that. But the understanding of who we are in Christ really brings that thing home. It brings it full circle. It makes it make sense. So I wanted to kind of share these things because it gives us an understanding that the Christian model of a person helps us to make sense of how to use all the parts of our mind therapeutically and in context, and helps us kind of take out the central problem. Like, we have to take out the highest level problem, which is the ultimate danger of loss of salvation. We take out that thing through the sacraments, so we take that out through who we are in Christ, so we take that out through that. And when we have that level, the noetic level, understood and making sense, then we're in a sense of safety. And we understand that we are safe in Christ, and we understand who we are in Christ. That's the whole big deal at the very top. And then once we have this sense of safety established, we understand then that it's safe to have thoughts, it's safe to have feelings, it's safe to have emotions, it's safe for our body to be sick or well, it doesn't matter. All these things are safe because of our safety in Christ and who we are in Christ and all that stuff. And so then that allows us not to have to get over inflamed about these things. It allows us to use these other levels of kinds of intervention in a light and appropriate manner. It allows us to kind of realize that these things are part of us, that we're not just merely a soul that's in Christ, but we have these lower elements because we're going to be a body and soul in Christ. A body, a mind, a soul in Christ is who we are. It allows us to kind of integrate the use of various abilities of the mind and the heart and all these things in our interventions with ourselves, but allows us them to be used in a context of safety. And this allows us to improve upon the possibility of, and the way that this works sometimes in things like internal family systems or things like that, or Buddhist type therapies or these type of things, where you end up with a kind of secular understanding of this self separate from these other things. That's not healthy ultimately, because it splits it off. And so this really helps to have this Christian understanding. It helps it to be authentic. It helps it to use all these different elements and interventions in a healthy way. And I hope this kind of gives it just a general sense, just talking through these things, of how this can possibly work. So this is how, it's kind of an interior topography of how this plays out. Because, the ultimate thing is that when thoughts come in, they are disturbing to us. If we flinch, if we think we're in danger, we're going to inflame that so much more. This is what happens, as I said, in things like scrupulosity. You start to think you're in danger, and then that clouds your thinking. And you don't realize who you are in Christ. You don't realize that you're safe. And that's what really brings everything down, because you want to know who you are in Christ in that place of understanding and prayer, that place of knowing and prayer, which is our spiritual heart. We know that when we're operating not in the carnal mind that we're out down in the valley trying to fight. We're in the castle. We're in the noetic understanding of who we are. We have the right mindset. And so when we have that, we then understand how to use all the different parts of ourselves in an authentic way. And we don't get as